Hey,
Oh, okay.
I guess it is.
It is what? It is.
It is live. It
is live.
Yes.
Calling Chris Anderson live in
Windsor.
Windsor.
For 2 shows in a row. So it's kind of incredible.
And what's the matter? What's the matter? Are you injured?
Yeah,
You've been taken off the road?
I have been.
Retired?
I've been retired. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And you're in Chicago?
I'm in the normal place, right? I'm in my high above Chicago's Michigan Avenue.
Right.
I'm coming to you from here. And welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Tours for helping to bring you this show. And check out their rich offering of military history tours at Stephen Ambrose Tours. And look, whether you're watching live, whether you're watching on replay, maybe you're not watching at all. Maybe you're listening to the HHH
podcast.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about the U.S. Army in the Pacific in 1944. So let us know what you're drinking if you are. And Chris, we should thank everybody who's a top shelf patron.
Absolutely. We thank you very, very much. Absolutely.
The list is filling up, but honestly, we have ways to add names.
We have ways, and we'd like to try some of those ways. So
yeah, we'd like to experiment with that. So you can join us as a top shelf patron at www.patreon.com/History Happy Hour. So I know there's all sorts of exciting football coming in. Don't tell us any of the scores, please, everybody, because some of us are trying to wait and find out later. Don't ruin it. Don't ruin it for Chris.
They're gonna lose.
Don't ruin it for Chris.
Don't ruin it for me. That's right.
Yeah. Chris, who's out there? Who's watching?
Yeah. Lizzie Borden is joining us from London, and Jim Booten from Mississauga, Canada, which is always good. Xavier, so we're international. Good to see Xavier again. Doug McCord, Jan Kemp Boyle from St. Louis, so probably just down the street from John.
Yeah. All right. So we got a crew in the house.
We have a show. Yeah.
I'm sure as the early games start to end, we'll get
stop.
We'll get people coming in. All right. Well, give me a cue and I'll move on.
All right. Hey. The bar is open.
Yes. And today we're going to talk to historian John McManus, who's returning to History Happy Hour for the second time to discuss Volume 2 of his Pacific War trilogy, Island Infernos. John is a highly regarded military historian. He's an author. He's a professor of military history at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. He served as a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's published 13 books, and he is the co-host of the fairly new video and audio podcast World War II Live. So we're here live with the World War II Live co-host, John McManus. How are you doing, John?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
John, what were you doing 1 year ago today?
1 year ago today, I think I was interviewing you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nothing like a little self-promotion.
Oh, yeah. There we were
at Rogues Gallery. Yeah. So that was for another podcast I do called Someone Talked. And as you see, Rick and I are sitting there with John Long and April Cheek-Messier at the National D-Day Memorial.
So we had a good time there. That was the day that I came up and I was convinced that we'd already interviewed you, and I think I managed to convince you of that as well.
I thought you had too, honestly.
Yeah.
It was so memorable. Yeah.
So we got a little confused. John, in our last interview about Volume 1, we talked about the fact that most people don't realize that the Army far outnumbered the Marines in the Pacific. So this is a very interesting series, and this particular book starts in January 1944. So what's the situation in the Pacific, broadly speaking, for the U.S. Army at the dawn of 1944?
Yeah, the U.S. Army is becoming a really formidable beast by that point in time. It had sort of weathered the worst, which of course was the catastrophe that happens in the Philippines in 1941-42. And then since then, 1943 had been a pretty big year of turnaround operations on New Guinea. but also, obviously the invasion of Tarawa features an army side to the equation too. At an island called Macon, you have an invasion there by the 27th Infantry Division. The War Department was starting to prioritize sending more ground combat power to the Pacific, in part also, too, for the logistical side, too. The Marines had invaded at Bougainville in November 1943, and the idea is to begin securing all the sea lanes of the Solomon Islands and to cut off the famous Japanese naval base at Rabaul. And so the Marines had done that initial work, but then you're going to have multiple army divisions. The 37th in America, in particular, they're going to man a major perimeter there, and some pretty heavy fighting is going to happen in 44. So you're starting to see, just like in the European theater, an army that had taken some lumps, but had learned lessons and was becoming quite formidable in terms of its combined arms and its firepower, its ability to launch amphibious operations. And 44 then is going to be really a pivotal year, just really similar to the European theater.
So, John, picking up on that, what can you say sort of about the evolution of the Army's amphibious warfare doctrine? I mean, what does the Army look like in 44 and how they do things that maybe they didn't in, say, 42 or 43?
Yeah, it's just so much more professional, Chris. I mean, certainly we've got more landing craft at our disposal now because of the American shipbuilding and industrial might. So obviously you've got more LSTs, you've got more famous Higgins boats, all this kind of thing. But really, I think the biggest thing that has changed, say, from 42 to 44 is working very closely with the other services, especially the Navy. And part of it is just like the unglamorous side of operations, like how you load ships. I mean, like how do you prioritize the cargo and how do you coordinate with them in terms of, like, let's say you're the Army staff officers and you're working with the Navy staff officers. They're going to tell you, well, this is the amount of room we have. This is what you can transport in terms of material and people and whatever. And now we got to figure out how we reorganize all of our tables of operation and equipment and then our units. I mean, you name it. So by 1944, this had come a long way. It wasn't where it's going to get to. I would argue that the capstone of it begins late 1944 in the invasion of Leyte, which is a massive operation. In terms of American ground combat units sent ashore, it's larger than the American contribution to Normandy in that sense. But so in the beginning of the year, we are just starting to get to that point.
Okay.
John, can you talk about some of the things that make fighting in the Pacific different than fighting in Europe? I was starting to make a list when I was reading your book, and maybe you can hit a few, and maybe I'll cue you on a few later on in the interview if you don't hit them now.
Yeah, I mean, everything is just really difficult in the Pacific because in most of these places, there's just no infrastructure. You've got to build whatever roads you need. You have to improve upon any harbors that could be there. And that's so like a lot of the depot companies are going to be doing that in engineering units. Aviation engineers have to basically build airfields and air bases from scratch. Building such things as warehouses, I mean, is just an enormous effort. Dealing with the water table in a lot of these places where you're getting, dozens and dozens of inches of rain per year and mud and topsoil. I mean, jungles. I mean, it's a nightmare, honestly. And of course, everything has to be moved, and that's very similar to Europe. But in Europe, you at least are going to have places that have some level of infrastructure especially once you're in Italy and certainly France. But you don't really have that much in the Pacific. And so I would say to a great extent, it's an engineer's war. And the Army really takes the lead in that, and a construction war too, because we remember the Seabees, the Navy Seabees, and for good reason, but similar to the Marines, there aren't that many of them in relation to Army aviation engineers and other engineer units that are going to be doing all this. And on the medical side, that's where we have some serious challenges. So in 1943 on New Guinea, General MacArthur's command generally was losing about 4 to 5 guys to disease for every one in combat against the Japanese. I mean, and I don't mean they're dead. I mean, they're out of action. And you can imagine all the infrastructure that takes to treat these guys and what that means for the momentum of your operation. So malaria and yellow fever are the big challenges. So on the medical side of the house, you have to have this vast infrastructure really just exist in many places in theater. So it's an enormous challenge.
So, and picking up on that, John, maybe, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but just to kind of
put him on the spot. Come on, let's do it.
All right, well, Rick said I could do it.
Right
No,
over
let's
here.
just give me some concrete examples of the logistics, and by that I mean, we say, well, the Pacific's really big, or it takes a lot. What in terms of like maybe how hard is it to move a division, or like, what is actually involved in actually getting to the theater and sustaining it?
Yeah, I mean, it takes well over 30 troop ships just to move a division, much less to supply it once it's ashore. Once it's ashore, you're probably talking about shipping multiple times that amount of shipping just to
Right.
keep it sustained. And usually that's going to be LST, so it's a different kind of ship. So the ship that's taking us from point A to point C or wherever is a classic kind of APA troop ship, just like you have in Europe. And of course, you can imagine the global demand for those ships as we're trying to send ground combat power overseas in all these places. So scheduling that is an enormous challenge. But then, like I mentioned, let's say once we land on Bougainville, once we land on Los Negros or at Hollandia, just to give a few examples of invasions that happened in 44, Kwajalein, now you're talking about really probably anywhere from hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping or more just to sustain those ground units once they're there. Bougainville is really interesting, I think, as a case study because the Marines invade in November. By February, March 1944, the Americans have basically created like their own city there, like a perimeter city. They're on the map that you guys are showing there. You can see that perimeter there. And then you can see that little island right offshore, a couple of them there. They become little airstrips and little staging areas. And then like anywhere near the coastline that you see within that perimeter is the rear. And that means warehouses. It means refrigeration plants, like even something, like churches that are built, basically tent churches, baseball fields. I mean, like basically American life going on there. But you can imagine how difficult it is going to be to sustain that way of life with this lifeline that goes all the way back to the West Coast, certainly the Hawaiian Islands, but also to the West Coast too.
Yeah.
It's just a constant conveyor belt of shipping that has to be in place to do this.
Well, just since we're looking at Bougainville, how far is it from the shore here to the apex there of the triangle, which is where some of the very fierce fighting takes place?
It's not far. I don't think the scale shows there. It's a few miles. I mean, it's a very intimate setting. And yet what I think is so interesting about it is that, like I mentioned, anywhere close to the coastline there, it might as well be a different world than what, say, like if we're up there on the front lines of the perimeter at what our world is. Because basically up there as combat soldiers, we're living in log reinforced bunkers and holes that have been built in this kind of continuous perimeter. And then you go, half a mile back, they're living the rear echelon lifestyle. Now they come under Japanese air raids sometimes. And of course they're within Japanese some mortar fire and maybe some artillery fire, but the Japanese have a heck of a time getting heavy weapons through that thick jungle, to bombard the perimeter the way they otherwise might have. It's a little different than Guadalcanal in that regard, even though they have a tough time at Guadalcanal with that too. But so I think it's kind of interesting, the experiential difference for American soldiers, depending on where you are and what your job is. If you're an American infantryman in the front of that perimeter, your days are very different than the guy in the rear getting the chance to play baseball or working in a warehouse or unloading ships or something like that. It's completely different kind of thing.
So, John, I just came back. I was in Italy for a month, and I was trying to explain the overall strategy of the Mediterranean theater operations to my groups. And you can't really, because it just seems to be one sort of, I don't know, happenstance after another, and there doesn't really seem to be a coherent or clear plan. So in dealing with the Pacific, what exactly is the plan or the objective for 44? Or are we still trying to figure this out?
By the time we get to 44, we really do have something of a kind of clear plan, I guess I'd say, in the sense of competing theaters. Nimitz's theater, which is, much of the Pacific, north, central, south, is focused on the famous island hopping, of course, that they're going to have from Tarawa onward. And of course, The Kwajalein operations, Operation Flintlock in the Marshall Islands, that's really their centerpiece at the beginning of the year. The core of their fighting that'll happen throughout the year, of course, happens in the Marianas in the summer of 1944, which you could argue, I mean, those are among the most important battles in the entire war against Japan.
Absolutely.
MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area, his focus, of course, is getting to the Philippines. But he's a long way off, as we get to on New Year's Day. He's a long way from that, and he's spent the better part of a year and a half kind of bogged down in New Guinea. So that's why the invasion of Los Negros in February 1944 looms as so important to capture a key airfield that allows him to have some mobility to advance farther westward. But the other thing I'd mentioned too, it doesn't just stop there. The Army's involved in continental operations too. Of course, famously, Joe Stilwell is working closely with Chiang Kai-shek, not happily, obviously, but the whole China-Burma India thing, which has now become a ground campaign, basically a regimental-size American infantry unit is going to be trying to secure road routes across North Burma in a heavily jungle campaign. That's Merrill's Marauders, who are pretty well known. So the Army's also involved in that too. They just don't have as many ground combat units to devote to that. And obviously they're fighting alongside British Imperial forces and the Nationalist Chinese. It's an allied effort, much more so than it is, say, in MacArthur's theater in the Southwest Pacific area, in which he's starting to kind of leave the Australians behind as we get into 44. And in Nimitz's theater of operations, it's primarily American units doing a lot of the ground fighting at that point.
So I don't want to overdo the big picture here, but I threw this map up, which is actually from the last time we talked to you. And MacArthur's area, the Southwest Pacific, that's the box in the lower left, right? That's
Right.
kind of where he is. And then what's the area that Nimitz is operating in?
Everything else.
Pretty much everything else. Yeah, exactly. Except for the continental side, like China and Burma and India, that's Stilwell's ballywhack. But Stilwell's preoccupation is creating that landward route of supply from India into China. That's what the whole North Burma campaign is about. But yeah, I mean, Nimitz, you get a sense of his challenges there just glancing at that map. I mean, look at the vastness of that theater. And obviously, one look at that map tells you how crucially important sea power and sea lanes are. But I point out, as I point out in the series, that's all great. But at the end, someone has to secure the land objectives. I mean, you just simply have to have that. And so that means you're going to have to deploy a lot of ground combat power to do this. And as I mentioned the last time I was on, the Army presence in the war against Japan is going to grow to 1.8 million soldiers. I mean, that's not Army Air Forces either. That's Army ground and service forces. So that's the third largest military force this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war. So it's an enormous commitment.
Can I follow up, Chris?
I guess.
Grudgingly.
Wow, I'm feeling the weight there. No, I just, you mentioned some battles, and I think Kwajalein, Hollandia, Los Negros, Bougainville, I'll add Biak, I think. These are all intense battles. You write about them in great detail. Fairly large numbers of troops are involved. I'm going to wager that hardly anybody has heard of most of these battles. So why don't we know more? I mean, people probably know about MacArthur and invading Leyte, and of course they know about Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But these battles that are important battles that happen, especially in the first 2/3 of 1944, largely unknown. Why do you think that is, and what's wrong with that?
They're fought in very inhospitable, unglamorous places that didn't mean much to Americans before and kind of haven't since. So it stands in complete oppositional difference to, say, Normandy, which is at the centerpiece of our historical memory of World War II. And honestly, you guys, when I think about this, it kind of bums me out in the sense that there's all these guys like from the 7th Infantry Division, say, who fought at Kwajalein, or this 1st Cavalry Division who fought at Los Negros, or the Americal and the 37th Divisions at Bougainville. I mean, just name a battle, who fought just as hard as people in Normandy or anywhere else that's more famous, but never had that great tribute, and popular memory, which I think is a shame. but there's only so much room there, right? So, so the point I try to make in this book and the others is that, these are really crucial battles to the defeat of Japan, and they may not be that well known, but it's really, if you really want to understand what the war was, what went on, why it turned out the way it is, you really just can't understand it without delving into these battles. I mean, and certainly you don't understand the average person's experiences there either. It's so that to me, if you want to understand what's going on in the war against Japan, you have to kind of dive into this unglamorous jungle maw.
Okay, well, so I'm going to pick up on that, and I'm going to bring in. There were two questions from Wally Morrison. I'm going to kind of add to that. One, Wally says, "Did Nimitz and MacArthur split of resources make sense?" And then he also asks, "How important were the Philippines really versus Somoza?" And I'm going to kind of cap that by saying, make a case for the Southwest Pacific area, because objectively, I just look at it as MacArthur's vanity project.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, far be it for me to defend MacArthur on a lot of levels,
but we kind of dealt with your love of MacArthur.
No, but I mean, realistically, I you look at the map, and I just
love.
Yeah, exactly. In quotes. No, it's a fair question, Chris, and Wally's questions are good. So yeah, I'd like to take them all on. So the Nimitz-MacArthur split. Let's cover that first. We live in a world of reality. The reality was in World War II, there was just absolutely no way that either the Army or the Navy was going to submit to control of one officer from one or the other service to control the whole Pacific War. And we just looked at the vastness of that map there. It's really questionable whether anyone really could. I mean, that's just ginormous. Even, we tend to forget, even in Europe, Eisenhower, once he becomes SHAEF, head of SHAEF, he's not in control of the Mediterranean theater of operations. So we kind of have a split theater there too, in that sense. So I do think in a practical sense, this did make some sense, but in the political / military geopolitical realities, this is simply what had to be done. So we end up with a kind of compromise between Nimitz and MacArthur. Nimitz is very determined to cooperate as much as he can with MacArthur. MacArthur quite the opposite sometimes.
Yes, somewhat less.
So I think Nimitz exercised a lot of forbearance there, and I think I think the structure will work probably more because of Nimitz than MacArthur, honestly. But I think in the end, though both were opposed to it on some level, I do think that it at least worked to a pragmatic extent. Now, Philippines and Formosa. Well, before that, let's talk SWAPA, because you don't have the Philippines or Formosa without SWAPA. Okay.
Right.
Well, if we could go back to that map there, like the vast theater map.
Sure.
Okay, so what the Japanese really want out of this war, once they go to war against the Western powers, is present-day Indonesia, what was the Dutch East Indies at that time. And the reason they want it is the resources that they can access there, especially oil, but also tin, rubber, all sorts of other goodies that the modern Japanese industrial economy and war effort really need.
And if we're trying to help somebody find that, that's the Sumatra, that's Java, that's all that whole area?
Borneo, that whole, a bunch of islands there. And of course, Indonesians suffer among the most of anybody on the planet in World War II in terms of loss of life. In part because of the Japanese presence there. But if you look at that part of the map, you can see the Philippines sits right astride what is today Indonesia and, of course, the home islands of Japan. If the Allies control those sea lanes and the Philippines, it makes the use of those resources extremely problematic for the Japanese. And so the Japanese really didn't want the Philippines per se in 41 and 42, but they kind of had to have them to get that bone out of their throat in a way. And they never really, honestly, fully control the Philippines. It's questionable to this day whether any central government entity really can or ever has. And so it becomes a kind of nest of guerrilla warfare against them. And so it's wearing them down in that respect. And ultimately, it's going to absorb a significant amount of the Imperial Japanese Army's ground combat presence in the Pacific. So on that level, it makes some sense, much less also to the kind of political level of this was an American colony that was moving towards independence. So the Senate had passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 saying, we're going to give the Philippines its independence in 1946. And so there were some, certainly MacArthur and many who supported him, that believed we owed it to the Filipinos to liberate them once we had lost control of the archipelago in 41 and 2. Now, I'm not advancing this as fact or whatever. I'm saying that could be an argument for it. Now, that then takes us into a discussion once we are coming back in 44, whether to go to the Philippines or Formosa. And this is debated, of course, at very, very high levels much of the year. And we all know where MacArthur comes down on that question. Not hard to figure that out. Now, Ernie King, the Chief of Naval Operations, basically the head of the Navy, feels very strongly we have to get to Formosa. That's present-day Taiwan, just in case anyone hasn't heard that.
Right off the coast of China there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right off of the Chinese coast, and that had been a Japanese colony with a lot of different, mixed ethnic heritage and whatever else. But King is of the opinion the Philippines are ancillary. We can sort of bypass the Philippines. We can blockade the Philippines. We can move closer in this direct line to Japan. And looking at that map and the geography, I mean, of course, that's kind of inarguable. But the question is, too, what kind of response are the Japanese going to have? How is Nimitz' flank going to be threatened from Japanese forces coming to the west if you don't deal with them in the Philippines and farther to the southwest? Beyond this, the reason they eventually decide not to go to Formosa is because they just were not going to be able to sustain the large enough land force there. Ultimately, even King is going to kind of have to admit this. In other words, they were studying this and they were realizing, the Army in both theaters doesn't have enough service troops in order to sustain these major combat forces that we're going to have to put ashore. And in addition to that, they figured it'd be a tougher fight because the population would not be pro-American, whereas it is in the Philippines. I tend to think that whole question has no real good right or wrong answer. And I know that's kind of a weenie answer. But,
yeah, it is kind of, John, but that's like...
but that's the way I feel about it, honestly, because let's say we do what King wants and we go to Formosa. There's no question that's going to have terrifying, horrible consequences for the people of the Philippines. It's going to lead to famine there. It's going to lead to Japanese crackdowns on the population, much less our POWs in the Philippines. It will have consequences along those lines, and we'll end up in a really tough fight in Formosa. On the other hand, we all know what happens once they do go to the Philippines.
Right.
Oh, it's
the Philippines. Right.
Yeah.
They suffer horribly. Their cities are destroyed.
I know. So to me, it's one of these situations where there isn't really a good answer. So, but for those who argue one way or the other, I totally get where they're coming from. I just think there was a hell of a difficult choice that they had to make back then. And we all know to some extent why it turns out the way it does because of MacArthur's influence, which is, quite profound.
Quite profound.
Well, okay. So MacArthur's somebody we know, right? He comes down to us through history.
Well.
Nimitz is somebody we know. Curtis LeMay is somebody we know. There's a person who's a lot less well known. I mean, there's a bunch of them. I could pick any one of half a dozen names here, but I'll pick one. General George Kenney, who is involved with the U.S. Army Air Corps. Tell us a little bit about him and his role and why he's successful in the Pacific, and maybe if you can add on to it, why we don't remember him the way we remember some other people.
Yeah, I think it's a shame we don't, because he is one of the most successful commanders we have in the entire war, really in all of our military history, honestly. I mean, George Kenney, just in case anyone hasn't heard of him, he's in the Army Air Forces. He is a pilot, an airman. He becomes MacArthur's main aerial commander. He initially takes command of what's called the 5th Air Force that's under MacArthur's command, and then eventually he will command larger than just like one Air Force. So you've all heard of the 8th Air Force, and so this is the 5th Air Force, a kind of equivalent formation, but much more heavy on the medium bombers and fighters in the South Pacific. Eventually he's going to have even more than that by the time we get to late 44 and 45. What's interesting about Kenney is how hard he works to get on well with MacArthur, and that usually would take hard work to get on well with someone like him, but MacArthur had come out of the whole Philippines Philippines experience in 42, completely disillusioned with the Air Force. He fires his aerial commander, George Brett, not the baseball player, but the aerial commander, and he says, I just don't have any confidence in these guys, and the heck with them. Kenny kind of begins to rehabilitate the Air Forces in MacArthur's mind and really kind of teach him how he can use air power so productively. And that's going to be a major, major advantage for MacArthur going forward. By 1944, he is presiding over a pretty innovative force. The biggest thing that he pulls off that year is destroying the better part of most Japanese aerial assets around Hollandia in the early months of 1944. And that really paves the way for that major outflanking amphibious invasion, which accelerates the pace of the war, does all kinds of good things for the Allied side. Why don't we remember Kenny? I think it's because he serves under MacArthur, and MacArthur sucks the oxygen out of the room for practically anybody who's with him. So we don't remember a lot of his commanders, unfortunately, including his two fine ground commanders.
Eichelberger.
And that was going to be kind of, I'm going to leap on there because those are two guys that
leap away.
I think that we should talk about because, again, I hate to keep relying on Italy, but I just spent a lot of time there. U.S. commanders don't come off looking so great there. But when you look at Kruger and Eichelberger, these are two really competent guys. Why don't you talk about them? And again, like with Kenny, why don't we know more about these guys?
In part because of where they fought, in the South Pacific, and then in this whole really unglamorous campaign to liberate the Philippines in 44 and 45, which is quite equivalent with some of the heavy fighting in Europe, that we also kind of overlook, whether it's the Colmar Pocket, just places like that where the fighting is constantly going on. But so these two guys become MacArthur's army commanders, Kruger with the 6th Army and Eichelberger with the 8th Army. And so by the end of the war, they're both quite successful, but in some ways they're really similar. They're both very honest people, dedicated military professionals. They both have a real flair for understanding and thinking about the average private soldier, in part because Kruger was one. He joined the Army as a private originally. But also, they both had a great commitment to their troops. But they're also very different personality-wise. Kruger was kind of rude, brusque, circumspect, kind of methodical and cautious, the words often associated with him, but solid and competent. You're not going to have a disaster with Kruger. You know what I mean? He's not going to put his head out on the chopping block. But that's part of the problem, too, in some ways, too, is he doesn't take a lot of risks. Eichelberger is really kind of the Patton of the Pacific on a lot of levels. He's incredibly aggressive. He leads from the front. He's warm. He's witty. He can't understand rude people. He's wanting military glory for himself, and he becomes resentful when he doesn't get it. And he comes to really resent MacArthur for kind of holding his light under a bushel and preventing him from going and getting a major command under Eisenhower in the European theater, which I found in my research almost certainly would have happened if not machinations. So,
which is certainly something Eisenhower could sympathize with.
Oh yeah, because Eisenhower had dealt with that whole MacArthur nightmare for years. So they kind of by the way, Chris, he and Eichelberger kind of bonded over that in a little way. They got on pretty well, and they both had their sort of experiences with MacArthur. And Eichelberger had actually worked for MacArthur when MacArthur was chief of staff in the 30s, so he knew him well even before World War II. So he kind of has this Eichelberger kind of has this love-hate relationship with MacArthur. I think it's fair to say Eisenhower probably has just a hate relationship with him, later on. But so I think it's really a shame because there's a lot to learn from Kruger and Eichelberger and their operations. They command enormous amounts of ground troops. The innovation in their amphibious operations, especially for Eichelberger, is just incredible. And I think there's a lot to learn from them.
There's so much in your book, and of course we're just going to be able to touch on a little bit of it. But one thing you got into a little bit, which obviously is a big issue in World War II in all the theaters, is racism, is sort of the Jim Crow treatment of Black troops, and kind of a sad story with there's a division in the Pacific that's an African-American division, the 93rd Division, and it's not a great story, and it doesn't reflect well on the some of the people, some of the white officers leading them, and some of the other people in the theater. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the 93rd Infantry Division was a segregated unit, like most units were in World War II, led primarily by white officers, with some black officers too, and NCOs. But they're going to be put into Bougainville. One of the regiments, the 24th, for instance, which by the way had a long history as an African American unit. But be that as it may, they're basically operating within this larger reality of an America that's deeply divided over race. And of course, we all know who really get shots in relation to race on the eve of World War II. It tends to be the segregationists, this kind of white supremacy that's in play in parts of the country. So the 93rd, my point is, from like an operational combat perspective, cannot just ease its way into action like any other unit. Like any other unit we could talk about today, where we'd say, they had the 90th Division, say, that had its first action in Normandy. It took some lumps in the hedgerows, and then it got better. The 93rd couldn't operate that way because of the issue of race, because of the toxic sludge, I call it, of Jim Crow racism that pervaded a lot of the country, because there were all sorts of people, white segregationists, who wanted them to fail, and are just thrilled for that possibility, and to sort of buttress their argument that African Americans were inferior, and thus that would justify making them second-class citizens. And then in reaction to that too, you have a growing civil rights movement. That's why I think World War II, one of many reasons why it's so incredibly important, because the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, comes out of it and does lead to some real change in the country during and after the war. So you have these two diametrically opposed kind of political viewpoints that are clashing. And so, like, the second group are trying to highlight anything good the 93rd does. They're the greatest ever. Sort of like that mythology you had for a while with the Tuskegee Airmen, that they never lost a bomber in combat, which comes out of a media source in World War II. And the 333rd, the Tuskegee Airmen, were amazing, but they're human beings too. I mean, it's okay if they lose a bomber here and there, like any other unit. But so that was the problem, is that there were so many people wanting to tear them down, that the reaction of those who wanted real, meaningful and better change was to build them up to beyond maybe what was true. And so you see the same thing with the 93rd. They end up with a kind of tough patrol that's not particularly well led, that goes sideways early on in Bougainville. And then, as you can imagine, that's seized upon by the segregation to say, see, they won't fight well. And so they can't just learn like any other unit. And the sad part is that the sort of institutional momentum, even though you have a very fair-minded guy in charge of the Bougainville battle named Oscar Griswold, nonetheless, he's running up against some pretty powerful forces of segregation and inequality and all this. And so the 93rd ends up getting just kind of broken up and used maybe for some patrolling here, and mainly to unload ships. The idea being servile labor is what African Americans should be doing, that kind of mentality. And so this is a combat unit trained as such that really isn't used for that. And even during the Philippines campaign, where we're really hurting for infantry manpower, just like we are elsewhere many times. Even MacArthur, who also is pretty fair-minded too in relation to race, it doesn't even consider using the 93rd. And I just think it's a really sad circumstance.
So, John, speaking of that, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the divisions that are in the Pacific. Now, for some reason, and this might just be coincidental, it's a two-part question, but the first is, why are there so many National Guard units that get sent out there? Do you know? And the other question is, I was thinking when I was reading your book about Michael Doubler's book about how American divisions evolved in combat and got better in Europe. So maybe, you could talk a little bit about these divisions that are in the Pacific, how they're prepared for this, how they perform, how they evolve, something about them.
Yeah, I think that especially at the beginning of the war, why are the National Guards units going there? Because that's who's available. They're just laying hands on anybody they can. Classic example, I think, is the 32nd Infantry Division, which is going to do some of the early fighting in the war. This is a Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, Michigan National Guard unit from a cold weather state. By all means, let's send them to the South Pacific where it's 95 degrees and 80% humidity, right? And they fight at Buna quite famously. They win the first American ground victory in World War II, actually at Buna in New Guinea. And then the 41st, that's a National Guard unit. Of course, you're going to have the 77th Division eventually there, so on and so forth. I think part of it is just this enormous pressure we have for global operations, and so I think some of it is really not necessarily like a conscious policy to send National Guard units there. It's whoever's available at any given time that we're talking about, and also we're going to have reserve units too, like the 96th Division. Reservists that are then called into active service. You see a lot of that too. What you don't see as much as you do in Europe is the units with a regular army tradition sent there. And so that's one thing that is a little bit different. The evolution of combat that we'll see, a lot of it has to do with learning how to exist in the jungle, how to fight in the jungle. Which then morphs into later in the war how to fight cave to cave warfare. So really the answer to all that, I think they find out, is a lot of combined arms and as many close-in weapons as you can get. I mean, that's kind of the lesson of Tarawa, too. I think that the Marines are learning is we need a lot of satchel charges. We need flamethrower teams. We need bazookas. It's the same thing with the Army.
Well, picking up on that, is the Army and Marine Corps talking about this? Or are they kind of evolving on their own and coming to the same conclusions?
The majority of the time, when they're well led at the senior level, they are talking about that. They are working together. They are training together. So the example I give you on the good side is under General Roy Geiger, who's a Corps commander. He's a Marine Corps commander who has, for instance, the 77th Division under his command at Guam, and then he's got about a division and a half of Marines. Everybody's on the same team. Everybody's working together. Everybody's fighting together. Everybody is looked at the same way and trained up the same way and will fight much the same way. I do argue in this series, when you really look at the spear point, Marines and soldiers tended to fight very similarly in World War II, though we don't always think of it as such. And the Army generally would have more access to some heavier artillery, maybe, and more combined arms. That's true than the Marines sometimes. But overall, when you look at the spear point, they tend to fight pretty similar, and there's a lot of respect there. It's at the higher levels where the tension will happen sometimes.
So, like maybe between a couple of generals named Smith.
Yes, maybe like my
Smith v.
very
Smith,
dear friend Holland Smith.
Right. So tell us. So you've got a U.S. Army division, 27th, commanded by General Ralph Smith,
who I just want to say is probably the most well-read expert on the French military in Europe in the U.S. Army. So
and of course, and he speaks French. So of course,
and
he's
married to a French woman. Yes.
Right.
And
who, by the way, lived to be 103. I think he died in like 1998. He was the last division commander from World War II, and he's under a force commanded by General Holland Smith, whose nickname is.
Howlin' Mad.
Howlin' Mad. Yeah. Okay. Little conflict there. So tell us about that, and how does it not reflect on the differences between the Marine Corps and the Army?
Well, Holland Smith is determined to make sure there are differences between the Marine Corps and Army and to exacerbate them and make them worse. Holland Smith is a classic example, I would argue, of how one toxic...
Look, say what you think, okay? Don't hold back.
Because you're usually a lot more neutral in these things. You're usually a lot
I know, I usually... But I will say some good things about Holland Smith.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I will, don't worry.
Not too many, okay.
In this case, he's a classic example of one toxic individual in a leadership position can wreak havoc. This is a guy who is so biased against the other services, not just the Army, but the Navy too, that he detests. And he's all about his Marines, my Marines, this, that, and the other. So he doesn't create like a one-team mentality. He doesn't like the 27th Infantry Division, doesn't think they're any good, and he's not shy about telling anyone and everyone who will listen. He's a blowhard. He has bluster. He paints himself. This is the issue I have with him too, guys. He tries to sort of project this whole demeanor like he's this world-weary combat Marine. Holland Smith had earned his commission basically through influence. His father was a very influential lawyer in Alabama. And initially, Holland Smith was going to practice law under his father, but he didn't want to do that. And so he was looking at a military career. Ironically, he was thinking of being an Army officer originally. There just wasn't a slot available for him. So he kind of gets his commission through influence, not through the Naval Academy or OCS, like most Marine officers had. And that's no easy route. He became, here's the good part, the thing I'm going to say about him. He becomes over time really one of our leading theorists on amphibious operations. He certainly knows that. And I think had he been in a training command during this war, he would have been a major force multiplier. The fact that he's in a combat command in an inter-service setting is not to his strength. So he projects himself as a combat Marine, but he's seen very little action in his life. And in the Battle of Saipan, he spends most of his time in the rear at a CP or aboard ship, basically plotting to basically fire Ralph Smith, while Ralph Smith is actually on the front lines, dodging death. That's the 27th Division coming ashore at Saipan. Ralph Smith is a lead from the front guy. He comes very close to getting killed even before he is relieved. So I just think for Holland Smith to kind of call people out and say they're cowards and whatnot, I think is just outrageous. I think the 27th Division didn't deserve that. They fought pretty well. And I think you also, if you're going to fire somebody, you're going to make all these statements, you need to go and visit the front line yourself and fire them face to face and really assess things yourself. He doesn't do that. So when he creates this whole Army Marine Corps brouhaha out of that mess, it's his privilege to fire Ralph Smith, of course, as a superior. But I think most would agree it wasn't a good call. And then he turns it into a kind of Army Marine brouhaha that then leads to really bad things for the American war effort, which I think is just a shame. And so, Nimitz basically realizes this and kind of kicks him upstairs after the whole Saipan thing, because the Army basically says, we're not going to serve under this guy again. And I don't blame them one bit. They just didn't respect him because of the way he had operated, not because of that he fired Ralph Smith, but all the circumstance around it and how he kind of is calling out the Army, like they're all cowards kind of thing. It's just really, kind of beyond the pale.
So, John, as we're running out of time, I mean, again, as Rick said, there's a lot to unpack here. But there's some things that really kind of struck me. And one of them I wanted to get you to elaborate on a bit was you talk about a scared Japanese intelligence officer retreating through the jungles of New Guinea, and he's got a big briefcase full of stuff that he probably doesn't want to lug around, and he throws it into the swamp or a pond or a lake near Sio, New Guinea, and it's full of all the Japanese Army code books, which I had never heard anything about this. And A, tell us about this, and B, why don't we know more about this? Seems like a major bit of news.
It is. It's such a game changer. It's the craziest thing that happens at
did you know about this before you started researching the book? I've never even heard of it.
I knew a little bit about it because I had met Ed Dre many years ago, and he was the leading scholar. Yeah. But I didn't know it well, Chris. I mean, I didn't know the real ins and outs and the larger implications until I did this series, honestly. And so, so we don't know who this guy is, but I would argue he, in terms of damage to the Japanese war effort,
right?
I mean, I can't think of anybody who did more. I mean, so what happens is that he abandons, like you said, the code books in this, I don't know how to say it, like a steamer trunk of some kind, plunge it into a swamp, and he figures, all right, nobody will find it there and it'll all be destroyed by the wetness and whatever. But the really bad thing is he tells his superiors the code books are destroyed. Because they're supposed to burn them, but they couldn't because it was so wet and moist and it was so difficult in the jungle. That's understandable, but to kind of lie to your superiors so that they think, okay, well, we're good. I guess none of that has been compromised. Well, predictably, of course, the Allies, the Australians, are the ones who find this stuff. And it's really quite ingenious. So MacArthur had an enormous headquarters complex, of course, back in Australia and in the forward HQ in New Guinea. He has what's called the Allied Translator and Interpreter section. And so they had been through the whole war capturing a lot of Japanese material, including diaries, and translating a lot of it. And so this becomes sort of Exhibit A that they're going to work on. They use early microwave technology to basically bake the pages so that they become preserved and readable again. And they basically have the better part of many of the Imperial Japanese Army's operational codes in 43 and early 44, which then allows them to understand the Japanese order of battle and the disposition of Japanese forces on the north coast of New Guinea, which then allows MacArthur to plan the Hollandia invasion, which outflanks them and really accelerates the whole war onto the Philippines. So it's an enormous game changer. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
Well, and on a smaller scale, you have a section where you write about the Merrill's Marauders. And one of the things that I found interesting in that is that this unit, which is fighting in Burma as part of an offensive under General Joseph Stilwell, they have, I think, 14 Nisei soldiers, Japanese Americans for them. And that intelligence is also powering a lot of what they do, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and these guys are serving all over the Pacific, not just with Merrill's Marauders. The Japanese Americans are going to the Pacific, and they are serving in that same kind of role of like interpreters, intel people. I mean, there's several guys who are operating with Merrill's Marauders who are right there at the front lines with these guys.
There's a guy, Roy
Matsumoto.
And he's amazing story.
Well, it's incredible. Yeah. And so he's just one of many. But yeah, in his case, so if you can imagine, Merrill's Marauders are operating like deep in the North Burma jungle. So they don't really have a continuous supply line. They're being resupplied by air. And you can imagine the challenges of that. So they're basically outnumbered by the Japanese, but the Japanese don't know where they are. And it's all a very confusing kind of maw. So Matsumoto, of course, is a Japanese speaking guy, is a Japanese American. And he is able to tap into one of the main Japanese phone lines and eavesdrop on their conversations. It just so happens that the unit he's eavesdropping on speaks a dialect of Japanese that is similar to Matsumoto's family. And I'm not a Japanese linguist, so I apologize. I didn't know the specifics of that. But as he later told it, he could understand them, and then he could report what was going on, to the larger command. And so they know then a lot about Japanese movements and intentions. They know where the Japanese bases are. It's one of the reasons why Merrill's Marauders could operate the way they had with that kind of mobility in the jungle setting and really run rings around the Japanese, and because of Matsumoto and several other guys too.
He's up in a tree, right?
Yeah.
He's like peeing in his pants because he can't step away from being up in his tree to listen in, because what he's doing is so important.
Exactly. He couldn't get away. Yeah, he's peeing in his pants. This is war,
Incredible story.
Right? He's in the Ranger Hall of Fame nowadays, by the way.
And he's another guy who lived to be 100+ years old.
Yeah. And I'm really glad I got to tell his story and others like him, because I think that, that's another side of the Pacific War that we tend to either forget about or not know about, is Japanese Americans serving in that war, and, more to lose than anybody, arguably, if they're ever captured, anything like that. It's going to be a rough deal for them, and yet
they're going to probably have difficult interpersonal relations with other American soldiers as well. I don't know if you know anything about that, but
definitely. There's points of tension. There's a guy on Corregidor, for instance, when the Americans invade Corregidor in 1945, who's serving in something of the same role, and he runs up against an officer who doesn't trust him and says, this guy is Japanese, we can't trust him, we don't like him, all this nonsense. And I mean, he's running up against that kind of bias, really racism, honestly. And so he has to push back against that. And fortunately, he is able to get the attention of other commanders who, with a broader mind. And he, too, will be a major force multiplier in understanding where the Japanese are, where they're not, where they're weak, once we're fighting at Corregidor. This is like February of 1945. So these guys are all over the Pacific, not always, serving in frontline combat dramatic, always. Some of them are in MacArthur's ATIS, or Allied Translator Interpreter section, or elsewhere, working for Nimitz or whatever, but they are, their contributions, I think, are really outsized, relative to how many people there were.
So John, since we're kind of rapidly approaching the end here, I wanted to ask you, now we're 2 volumes in, you've obviously spent a lot of time in the Pacific. Looking back at it, is there anything that really surprised you in researching volume 2? What kind of stuck with you as you were going through all this?
What really surprised me, Chris, is how much Japanese material I was able to access, because I'm primarily an American historian. I do that, but I also certainly wanted to present the Japanese point of view so much as I could, and their planning and their intentions. But and I figured I could do some of that, and I could with the translation of some of their official histories and all the other material. But what did surprise me, and to refer back to the whole ATIS, is how many Japanese diaries there were, how many Japanese first-hand accounts from average soldiers or sailors. It was fascinating because this stuff was captured by Allied service people and then translated, and then it remains in the archives to this day. Now you have to wade through a lot of chaff, the stuff that's very innocuous or not interesting, but then you get to a lot of really interesting material. And for instance, like in the first volume, Fire and Fortitude, I had diaries from people who were actually at Buna, basically manning this doomed perimeter against the 32nd Division and the Australians. I mean, it was really interesting to get their human story.
Yeah.
It's very poignant on it, and very sad too, because they're just young guys like the Americans, and want to live, and they care about their families. And so I like that I was able to portray that you can see the quote enemy as human, because that's the sad part of war, is that we tend to dehumanize. And I think sometimes history can be that way too, just not intentionally, but because of whatever sources are available to us. Maybe we can't present the other perspective. In this case, I was surprised at how much I could, and just how incredibly poignant it all was.
Yeah, and that's something that you do really well in the book, and continues in volume 2, and I'm sure will in volume 3. We are so near the end, but I want to ask, because it relates to what you were just talking about. We don't often have a chance to look at things from the point of view of the enemy, but by early 1944, it ought to be clear to the Japanese that they cannot win this war against America. That whatever chance they had is gone. So, I mean, it's an obvious question. Why don't they try for something better than just this mass annihilation of their soldiers on island after island after island, and then eventually the possibility of a huge battle on the mainland? What?
They have to learn that too, that the Americans are controlling the air and the sea increasingly, especially as 1944, goes on. That it doesn't make sense to try and resist at the waterline, or to attack the Americans, for instance, like the Japanese do at Bougainville. I mean, I have a major chapter on that, and that's overlooked. It's just an enormous, violent battle in which the Japanese are trying to snuff out that American city there, that perimeter we were talking about earlier. It's a disaster for them, an absolute unmitigated disaster. They begin to understand by about the middle part of the year and later that it's much more to their advantage to hunker down, fight to the death, and bleed the Americans. And in that scenario, it's possible they could get something out of this war, short of being conquered and occupied by the Americans. They could maybe preserve their empire. And so there are reasons to fight, but the average Japanese serviceman doesn't really understand that the war is looking as badly as it does, because, of course, there's ignorance and there's lies and there's all this stuff too. So I think that what really shines through to me about it all is, and I think we tend to either not know about this or overlook it in the West, the average Japanese in the war viewed himself as a liberator, liberating fellow Asians from white colonialism, especially those fighting on the Asian continent, but also elsewhere in the Pacific. And what they don't realize is Japan is just going to be another imperial power of another stripe, and much worse, really, arguably, than the white imperial powers ever had been. So, especially in the Philippines. So it's very disillusioning for many Japanese to kind of see that over time. And that becomes, in a way, the kind of point of disillusionment, certainly, but the point of anger for them, maybe by the end of the war, because I think some of the most savvy among them are realizing that they've been kind of played by these hyper-militarists in Tokyo, who have plunged Japan into this war and really used them on many levels. It's really quite sad.
John McManus, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. John's book is Island Infernos. It's the second volume of his 3-volume history of the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater. We'll have him on sometime next year to talk about volume 3. Can't wait to see what happens. Right? How is it all? Oh, don't give it away. How is it all going to turn out? But John, thank you so much for joining us again today, and best of luck to you on everything that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, John.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
All right.
It's such a good interview. I know he can still hear us, so I know it's
you're just
buttering him up, right?
You are, man. I can see it now. He's laughing at you.
Yeah, he should be. He should be. Next week, Chris, we'll have on another author. What a shock!
Oh, really?
Yeah, I can't even believe it. No, David Nassau is going to come on to talk about his book, The Wounded Generation. You've heard a little bit about this, right?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. It's a kind of a topic about the war that doesn't really get enough attention. And I know we've talked to Keith Lowe a bit about his books, and he's really interested in what happens when the shooting stops. And this should be equally as informative. Like what does the quote unquote greatest generation do when they get home?
Yeah, and yeah, sort of what's the story behind that? So looking forward to that. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon. And if you want to look at some of our 276 previous episodes,
please feel free.
historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks everybody. Stay safe.